Despite the last part of my bikepacking trip only taking like 24 hours, a surprising amount of crazy crap happened. Like almost seriously hurting myself.
Oh my. That was dangerous.
Or apparently being live on set on an episode of Jerry Springer. I feel like it's worth taking a look at everything that happened, and also expand a bit on some of the things I talked about during that video. So one of the things that I had mentioned while out on that trip was that my plan to slowly start filling in sections of the Trans-Canada Trail, also known as the Great Trail, over the next few years. I mean, I don't have the time to do the entire thing in one fell swoop, but it would be nice to dedicate some of my trips in the future to filling it in section by section over time. Take a section or two here, or 2 weeks to fill in a longer section here. And if you've ever taken a look at the Trans-Canada Trail, basically it's a trail that covers the entirety of Canada from coast to coast, and it goes to every province and even every territory. As I fill it in, I'll be using different electric rideables. Some of the trail isn't even on ground, some of it is actually out on the water. And the whole point is for me to use electric rideables to do all the sections. So obviously my electric bike, like you've seen me do on this bikepacking trip. You've seen me use my electric skateboard on some of my skatepacking trips. I'm in the middle of building an electric snowboard, so that can do some sections of the trail during wintertime when there's snow on the ground. And for the water sections, right now I'm in the process of taking my inflatable boat and basically building a self-driving boat out of it using an electric trolling motor and RG-Pilot. Ideally, I'd also like to eventually get an electric surfboard, but I'm still trying to figure out the exact legality of them. So as for that trip itself, the campsite that I had, the ground was super tough because it was technically an RV site, I think. So years of vehicles, especially heavy vehicles like RVs, being parked on the ground, and it just produced like the hardest, densest ground. I really had to hammer in those tent stakes. I had to use a random brick that I found to hammer them in deep enough to hold. So some of them actually got mashed up pretty good. The tips got all mangled, and I basically have to replace these tent stakes entirely, which is fine. I printed off some new ones to take the place of these guys. Yeah. It had a pretty spectacular failure. Some of them got off a little bit lighter, but still need a tiny bit of maintenance. As you can see, the tips got mashed down a little bit. I'm just going to take my knife and redo the tip so that it's not so curved and mashed up at the tip there. So it wasn't just the tent stakes that got obliterated during this little 24-hour trip. I actually managed to do some damage to my 3D printed tent stake, which I did a video on. I thought it would actually hold up to heat as hot as boiling water, but if it's left in it for longer than a few seconds at a time, it'll actually soften it up. And I know it's hard to tell because I actually reheated it up and kind of morphed it back into shape. It got really deformed. I had made some instant noodles and I left it sitting in the soup, and it was basically deformed like this, and I had to fix it by heating it up and kind of bending it back into shape. So unfortunately, I think that's going to put a pause on this being in my kit. I put the titanium one back in. And speaking of that campground, oh man, was that campsite horrendous. So that campsite was actually one of the cheapest campsites I've ever seen in and around southern Ontario here, and now I understand why. Basically, the campground that was sort of adjacent to mine at a diagonal, like if my campsite was here, theirs was like this. It was like full on Jerry Springer over there late at night. The father and the mother got into a heated argument. There was a bunch of kids there too, and basically I guess he got in his truck and went to storm off. The kids are like running and screaming after the truck, being like, "No, daddy, please don't go." And the mom was like kind of tripping over herself. And then he came back a little bit once it started to get dark at the campground. And yeah, their arguing pretty much continued all the way into the night. The guy was screaming about ending it all. Yeah, it was insane. And then there was the guy in the trailer on the campsite a few past me. I guess he got absolutely wasted and he went to bed, and he left his poor dog outside of his trailer, not set up to a leash or anything, just left to wander around everybody's campsite. So I came back and his dog is just trouncing around my campsite, all over my sleeping pad, all over my stuff. Like, bro, why is your dog up in my stuff, man? And then there was all the lovely people that decided it wasn't important enough for just them to be able to hear their music. Nah, literally the entire campground had to be serenaded with their music. I couldn't really film because if I had caught any of that on camera and that made it to YouTube, then my video would be demonetized because it for sure would have been picked up by the algorithm because of how loud that music was. So once I got to camp, you'll notice the bits of footage that got pieced together were a little bit sporadic. That's why, and I guess that's the downside to going with a private campsite. And like I said, it was one of the cheapest campsites I've ever seen. So I guess you get what you pay for. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. If anyone's ever considering Trout Water family campground, I don't recommend it. I recommend trying to find a stealth campground nearby or some other sort of accommodation because it's garbage. So enough about that. Let's talk about the trail itself. The Durham section of the Trans-Canada Trail is very, very varied in what it offers. 21 kilometers of just windy dirt trails. I think it went through the Glen Major Forest, the Walker Woods, Durham Regional Forest before it finally spit me out onto some backcountry roads. And because a lot of those dirt trails are so twisty and windy, that took a good 75 to 80% of my day is just accomplishing that first leg. I was using so much of my own foot power pedaling that although I did the equivalent of about 22 kilometers from where I got dropped off to when I made it to the first charging stop in Uxbridge, I still had over half of my battery left, and using my new fast charger, it only took me an hour and a half to charge the bike back to full. And then once I was done charging there and then made it to the second destination of the day, the second leg, that was all rail trail, technically longer distance than what the first leg was, but that took me maybe a little bit over an hour to do 23 kilometers. Man, I flew. Let me put it into perspective. When I started charging my bike at the first charging stop of the day in Uxbridge, when I started charging, I started a timer on my phone for 3 hours because that was my expected charging time. I'd never used this charger before. 3 hours was the roughly calculated charge time, so that's what I set on my phone. And once I left from Uxbridge to Sunderland, all rail trail, I got to my campsite and I had just finished registering for a site at that campsite when the timer for my 3 hours of charging went off. Now, for probably one of the stupidest things I've ever put on camera for you guys to see was my lack of working brakes on that bike. It did have working brakes a little bit when I originally got the bike, but over time, the already loose brakes just basically wore down a little bit of pad, and with how much slack there was in the wire, they just stopped working. It wasn't making enough contact with the disc to stop the bike. So essentially for the entire first leg of the trip, I was stopping primarily by sticking my feet out like a longboarder. And some of the sections of that trail were very, very hilly and windy. What had happened, I don't know if I adequately explained exactly what happened during the trip itself. I came to a downhill section. I saw a sign that said danger, and I was already trying to stop, but I was just not able to stop. And there was a dirt switchback going down a steep hill, and it wasn't just a hill as the trail was going back and forth. No, at the edge of the trail it had a drop off. Next section of the switchback, drop off with a little bit of a kind of like a wall, and if I didn't bail, what was going to happen is I was going to hit that, and I was either going to General Lee off of that and seriously hurt myself, or the bike front tire was going to hit that wall and basically flip me end over end and basically launch me off the back of the bike. That would have probably not only been a trip ender, but potentially, depending on how I landed, I could have actually, been unalived from that. So basically at the last second, I kind of tilted the bike over and bailed to try and shift my momentum onto me and kind of down the trail, which worked. I stopped the bike, I stopped me, I didn't get hurt. Don't be like Mike. If you're doing a bikepacking trip, you're on anything that's going that fast, have a way to stop. And once I got to my first charging stop, I did fix the brakes, and now the brakes have the opposite problem. Now they're so tight that if I do that, I'm going to lock up both wheels. So switching back to that charger I mentioned, I had picked up a new charger for this trip. The one I originally wanted still wasn't in stock, so I did some digging around, and I found this really cheapish one on Amazon. Had the right barrel connector plug, it was the right voltage, so I figured I'd give it a shot. I did some testing at home, it worked, it charged the bike up, didn't explode the battery. And this charger is absolutely sketchy, man. It sparks when you plug it into the outlet and when you plug in the barrel connector, and it's actually not that heavy of a charger, which I'm surprised. You'd think it would have a pretty hefty heatsink inside for how fast it charges. It's a 4 amp charger, whereas the default one that's like twice as heavy as this thing is only a 2.5 amp charger. But no, it works. From almost empty to completely full, I think I clocked it at 2.5 hours. I had both chargers with me. I hadn't really tested this charger before, so I did want to do the smart thing and actually bring my original charger so that in the event something did happen with this super sketchy one, I did have the original charger I could fall back on. As for the bike itself, now that I've worked through a lot of the kinks with charging, I've sped up the charging speed, I still need to do things like get some armor and some slime so that I can better protect against stuff like flats, because right now it's just the inner tube and the tire. I have a spare inner tube in my bike kit now. I've got an actual bike pump. And now that I've got all that worked through, I'm actually finding riding the Super 73 on bikepacking trips to be really enjoyable. I know I've had some comments on YouTube about it not having any suspension and how that feels. You gotta remember, I'm used to riding around the electric skateboard on my trips for all day, and with that thing I can do up to 100 kilometers in a single day on super rough, really like eroded roads where like all the pebbles are kind of sticking up from the surface, so you, after like an hour or two of riding, like your feet are numb, all you feel is burning. So compared to that, riding on this bike is like butter. And to anyone worrying that Super 73 and electric bike content is going to replace the electric skateboard content, no, it's part of the rotation now. Electric skateboarding is still my primary fascination, but you're going to see me working in different electric ridables. So right now I've got the e-skate and I've got the e-bike. I'm working on the electric snowboard. I've got that electric inflatable boat that I'm planning on making autonomous to do adventures with. A whole bunch of other stuff in the pipeline that I'm not ready to talk about yet. And of course the Cybertruck at some point. And that's about it. For just a 24-hour trip, it was kind of nuts exactly how much crazy stuff happened. Quick reminder to subscribe if you guys are new to the channel, and I guess I will see you guys in the next video.